Picture this, you're outside enjoying a nice barbecue when all of a sudden someone hands you a nice cold beer. What brand of beer are you picturing? If you're from the US, you're probably thinking about a Budweiser or a Corona. For most Europeans, it's probably a Heineken. And for the East Asians here, it's probably going to be a San Mig or an Asahi. All of these brands are massive in their own right. But which one is truly the international biggest? Let's find out, as this is the history of the biggest beer brands in the world.
If you don't have Schlitz, you don't have gusto.
In the 1960s, the top of the global beer market was extremely competitive, but Schlitz pulled ever so slightly ahead of Budweiser and Japan's Kirin to become the world's best-selling individual beer label. Schlitz had been brewed in Milwaukee since the 19th century, and its identity was already legendary. The beer that made Milwaukee famous. But its dominance was not built on history alone. In the 1960s, Schlitz was being produced at breweries across the United States, allowing the same label to reach distant markets more quickly and cheaply. Instead of remaining a beer associated mainly with Milwaukee, Schlitz could now be found in bars, shops, and refrigerators across the country. The Milwaukee operation alone was producing roughly 27,000 barrels every day. The label also stood out through its packaging. Around 1960, Schlitz helped popularize the 16-ounce tall boy can, giving customers more beer in a package that was immediately recognizable in store shelves. Advertising was just as important. Move Up to Schlitz presented the label as an upgrade from ordinary beer, while When You're Out of Schlitz, You're Out of Beer went even further. It suggested that Schlitz was not merely one brand among many. It was the beer brand every bar and refrigerator was expected to carry. The company spent heavily to keep the Schlitz name visible on television, in magazines, and at sporting and entertainment events. Its flavor also suited the rapidly growing mass market. Schlitz was a light, approachable American lager, inexpensive enough for regular drinking, but marked with enough history and prestige to avoid feeling like a budget brand. That combination of availability, advertising, and familiarity allowed the label to remain narrowly ahead of its international competitors. But maintaining that enormous volume created pressure to make Schlitz faster and more cheaply. By the early 1970s, management had begun shortening the brewing process and replacing some traditional ingredients with less expensive alternatives. Each individual change appeared minor and sales initially remained strong, but together they began altering the beer itself. Some drinkers started noticing that Schlitz no longer tasted as consistent as it once had. The label was still one of the biggest beers in the world, but the decisions that would later destroy its reputation were already being made. And in 1972, Schlitz finally lost its narrow lead as Japan's Kirin overtook it as the world's best-selling beer brand. Kirin is a Japanese lager first brewed in 1888, and by 1972 it controlled around 60% of Japan's beer market. That's a crazy level of dominance for a single beer label to have in one of Asia's largest beer drinking nations. Backed by that enormous popularity at home and in many other Asian nations, Kirin remained the world's best-selling beer label for 2 years. While its first reign was quite brief, it would return on top a few more times in the coming decades. So I'll get back to them later, because for now, in 1974, Kirin was overtaken by America's new number one, Budweiser. Budweiser had been introduced almost a century earlier in 1876 by German immigrant Adolphus Busch and his business partner Karl Conrad. Inspired by the pale lagers of Bohemia, they created a lighter and more approachable beer than many of the heavier styles commonly sold in America at the time. The name itself referred to Budweis, a city in what is now known as Czechia. But Budweiser's real advantage was that it was designed to become a national brand. Anheuser-Busch used pasteurization to keep the beer fresh, bottled it on a huge scale, and transported it across the United States in refrigerated railway cars. At a time when most beer was still closely tied to its local brewery, Budweiser could be sold with a consistent taste thousands of kilometers from St. Louis. Budweiser very quickly became one of the biggest brands in American beers. By the early 1970s, Budweiser was being supported by a nationwide brewery and distribution network, enormous television campaigns, and advertising closely connected to American sports and popular culture. Jingles such as "When you say Budweiser, you've said it all" made the label seem less like one beer among many and more like the default American beer. As the United States used to be one of the world's largest beer markets at the time, the sheer scale of its American sales was enough to push it past Kirin in 1974. In 1976, Budweiser celebrated its 100th anniversary while still holding the global lead, but its reign would also be fairly brief. In 1978, the crown returned to Japan, as Kirin narrowly overtook Budweiser once again. And yes, Kirin was back again. After reclaiming the title in 1978, it managed to hold on to it for just 1 year before losing it again. The label that would overtake them again was another American lager that had rapidly climbed through the market, Miller. Miller's rise didn't start with a brewery, but with one of America's largest cigarette companies. Philip Morris had built a tobacco empire through brands such as Marlboro, using enormous advertising budgets and carefully constructed lifestyle imagery. In 1969, it moved into the beer industry by purchasing the Miller Brewing Company. Beer was a completely different product, but Philip Morris believed the same marketing techniques that sold cigarettes could also transform an aging beer label. That label was Miller High Life, first introduced in 1903, sold in a clear champagne-shaped bottle and promoted as the champagne of beers. It was originally positioned as something slightly refined and aspirational. But despite its long history, Miller remained far behind larger rivals such as Budweiser and Schlitz for much of the 20th century. Under Philip Morris, High Life was given an entirely new identity. Rather than emphasizing elegance or explaining how the beer was brewed, its advertising started presenting Miller as the reward for when you come home after a hard day of work. The phrase Miller time as a sort of synonym for resting time after work connected the label with factory workers, construction sites, sports, and evenings at the bar. It sold not just the beer, but an image of friendship, relaxation, and working class masculinity. The wider Miller name also benefited enormously from the launch of Miller Lite. Its famous "Tastes Great, Less Filling" commercials featured athletes, entertainers, and comedians, helping turn light beer from a niche diet product into a major American category. By 1980, Philip Morris' marketing power, Miller's nationwide distribution, and the enormous size of the American beer market had pushed the label to #1 in the world. But the reign here was brief as well. Higher prices and a severe recession weakened High Life, while consumers increasingly moved towards Budweiser, cheaper beers, and even Miller's own newer labels. By 1984, Miller had lost the title, and once again, Kirin was back.
Kirin Lager Beer.
Everybody drinks Kirin Lager Beer.
As Miller began falling away, Kirin was already strengthening its international presence. The Japanese label expanded overseas through exports and local brewing agreements, allowing it to reach new markets without shipping every bottle from Japan. The growing popularity of Japanese restaurants abroad also gave Kirin a natural place in bars and dining rooms across North America, Europe, and the rest of Asia. Then, in 1984, Kirin returned to #1 and quickly pulled ahead of every other beer on the chart. Its strength came primarily from Japan, where Kirin controlled about 60% of the Japanese beer market. Its nearest rivals weren't even close. Kirin's scale also allowed it to focus heavily on quality and consistency. As Japan's beer market continued growing, the brewer became one of the world's largest purchasers of high-grade aroma hops, helping preserve the slightly bitter flavor that distinguished Kirin Lager from many lighter American beers. Through the middle of the decade, this combination of overwhelming domestic sales and steady international expansion kept increasing Kirin's lead. While Budweiser and Miller battled for American drinkers, Kirin had already secured an extraordinary share of one of the world's largest and most concentrated beer markets. The first major threat appeared in 1987 when Asahi introduced Super Dry. Its crisp, clean finish created an entirely new dry beer trend and began pulling Japanese drinkers away from the more traditional lagers that had long controlled the market. But Kirin was so far ahead that even Asahi's explosive rise could not remove it immediately. Throughout the early 90s, Kirin remained the largest label on the chart while continuing to build recognition beyond Japan. This period also marked a broader shift in the beer industry. Japan was dominated by a handful of enormous national brewers, partly because strict production requirements had made it extremely difficult for smaller competitors to enter the market. Elsewhere in Asia, rising urban populations and consumer spending were turning the region into an increasingly important center of global beer consumption. Kirin had demonstrated just how powerful that Asian market could be. By the time its lead finally disappeared in 1996, it had remained the world's best-selling beer for 12 consecutive years. As for the brand to overtake them, it was none other than their local competitor, Asahi. But before we do that, thank you for watching up to this point in the video. If you like what you're watching, make sure to subscribe as that would help me out a ton. This is still a small channel, and with every new subscriber, I'm one step closer towards making this my dream job. Alright, back to the video. In 1997, Asahi finally completed the takeover, moving above Kirin and reaching the top of the chart. Super Dry had already transformed Japan's beer market, but taste alone was not enough to carry Asahi this far. The company had also spent years improving how quickly and efficiently the beer reached consumers. It pushed cans and six-packs into Japan's rapidly expanding supermarkets and convenience stores, rather than relying mainly on traditional neighborhood liquor shops. Asahi also made freshness central to the brand's identity, tightening quality controls and dramatically reducing the time between brewing and delivery. By the mid-1990s, some Asahi beer could reach retailers only around 10 days after production. Japan's economic strength also helped both Asahi and Kirin appear especially large on this chart, which measures revenue rather than simply the amount of beer sold. Back then, Japan was experiencing an economic bubble, beer prices were relatively high, and the strong value of the yen increased the international value of the company's domestic earnings. In 1998, the company established a dedicated American operation and began presenting Super Dry overseas as Japan's leading beer. Rather than hiding its origins and adapting to the local markets, Asahi marketed itself as a distinctly Japanese premium label. However, the Japanese market itself began changing during the early 2000s. High taxes on traditional beer encouraged consumers to move towards cheaper, low-malt drinks known as happoshu, followed by an even less expensive category of beer-flavored beverages. Asahi entered these new categories to protect its wider market share, becoming Japan's largest brewer across beer and happoshu in 2001. Super Dry, however, remained its flagship and a premium label around which the company built its international image. As the decade continued, Asahi strengthened its position in South Korea and other parts of Asia. By 2009, they were also moving more aggressively into Oceania, giving the brand an even larger international platform. By the end of the 2000s, it was available for purchase on all 7 continents. The beer label would remain on top for quite a while, so let's take a look at some of the other beers on this list that didn't receive a mention yet. Throughout the 2010s, Asahi remained at the top, but its closest challenger was usually Heineken. Unlike brands built mainly on one enormous domestic market, Heineken's strength came from being almost everywhere. Its green bottle, red star and premium image remained consistent across dozens of countries, making it one of the few labels that could compete near the top through genuinely worldwide sales. The decade's biggest climber, however, was Modelo. The Mexican lager began the period below several older global names, but rose rapidly as Modelo Especial became one of the fastest growing major imported beers in the United States. Corona Extra also spent the decade moving upward. Its clear bottle and lime ritual are famous worldwide and gave it a very distinct identity. Corona expanded across a wide range of international markets. By 2019, its revenue had grown by double digits for 5 consecutive years, with especially rapid growth outside Mexico. Budweiser and Bud Light also remained among the world's largest labels, although neither returned to number 1. The same goes for Kirin and Sapporo in Japan. Another brand that suddenly rose out of nowhere in the 2010s was Snow. It demonstrated the extraordinary scale of China, as it remained far less recognizable internationally than Heineken or Corona, but enormous domestic sales alone were enough to keep it among the world's biggest beers. By the end of the decade, the market beneath Asahi had become genuinely global. Almost every brand on this list wasn't relying on just the local market anymore, but exporting globally in large quantities. As the pandemic hit and people were confined into their own homes, beer consumption dropped globally, And in 2021, somewhat due to an unlikely connection, another beer would finally overtake Asahi, and the new champion of the beer market was none other than Corona.
Corona sales in China have surged about 25 times over the past 4 years.
Corona remains number one to this day, showing that its arrival at the top was not a brief result of the pandemic. By this point, the brand had developed one of the clearest images in the beer industry. Its advertising still centers on beaches, warm weather, and spending time outdoors. This gives Corona an identity that works across countries with very different cultures and drinking habits. Corona reached its 100th anniversary in 2025, but it rarely presents itself as an old or traditional beer. The brand continues to connect itself with surfing, travel, music festivals, and international sporting events, keeping the focus on relaxation and outdoor experiences. Corona also has an unusual business structure. AB InBev controls the brand across most of the world, while Constellation Brands holds a permanent license to produce and sell it in the United States. As a result, two different brewing companies promote the same Mexican label across its major markets. The beer is also adapting to a market in which more consumers are reducing their alcohol intake. Corona Cero is now sold across dozens of countries and has become one of the brand's main areas of growth. Its selection as the first global beer sponsor of the Olympic Games also gave the alcohol-free version an enormous international platform. This may offer a preview of the wider beer market's future. Overall, beer consumption has slowed or declined in many established markets, particularly as younger consumers drink less frequently and have more alternatives than previous generations. The largest beer brands are responding by expanding into alcohol-free beer, lighter products, and more expensive premium versions. The changing market makes it hard to predict who is going to overtake Corona in the near future. While beer consumption has been lower in most of the world, there's a few countries like India, Vietnam, and parts of Africa that still have considerable room to grow. So it could be that the future challenger for the number one spot will be a brand that's already established in these regions. For this reason, it seems like either Heineken or Modelo could be the ones to overtake Corona. As these rankings are based on revenue rather than the number of beers sold, it also means that exchange rates will have a strong effect on it. The future is uncertain, which makes it all the more exciting to see what's going to happen next. Let me know who you think is going to overtake Corona, and have a good one.